Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the beginning of a series that the Wilson Center is sponsoring together with the Smithsonian Institute and also a number of European embassies in Washington, D.C., called Earth Optimism. There's a lot of discussion, of course, of the climate change crisis, energy transitions, environmental changes. It's sort of depressing news, and rightly so in many cases. But there are also solutions, and we'd like to focus in this series on what is being done to address these challenges, because sometimes people aren't aware of actually progress that's being made in a number of areas. So this is a series that will continue through the year. We're starting this week, Earth Month, Earth Week, Earth Day, with 3 different programs. Today on the oceans, tomorrow on the hydrogen economy, and on Wednesday on offshore wind solutions. So today we're focused on the oceans. Our program today, besides our colleagues at the Smithsonian Institution, are the German Embassy, the Dutch Embassy, the French Embassy, and the British Embassy, who've all worked with us, and I want to thank them all for helping us. Today's moderator is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center and former U.S. Ambassador for Oceans and Fisheries at the Department of State, David Balton. And David will moderate and steer us through the program. So I want to thank David. I want to thank all of our participants and Teresa Ader of our staff who's put all this together. And I'll turn it to you, David. Thank you for helping us out.
Thanks very much, Dan. And let me add my welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure for me to take part in this Earth Optimism event. I'd like to also add my thanks to the Global Europe program at the Wilson Center and to our sponsors. As Dan said, our planet faces some serious challenges. The news concerning climate change and the broader environment generally is not good. But despite this, or maybe because of this, we do need to stay abreast of some positive developments, efforts taking place around the world that are making a difference, that are inspiring others, including us, to do more ourselves. And this morning, or afternoon or evening, depending where you're listening, we have 4 speakers who are working at the interface of oceans and climate. And I'd like to introduce all 4 of them to you briefly. You can find their full biographies on the Wilson Center website for this event. First, we have Hans Portner. He is the co-chair of the Intergovernmental Planet on Climate Change Working Group 2. He has served as lead author or coordinating author of several IPCC reports. His research interests include the effects of climate warming, ocean acidification, and hypoxia on marine mammals and marine ecosystems. Our second speaker will be Jennifer Brown. She is a coastal oceanographer at the National Oceanographic Centre in the UK. She is involved in modeling the impacts of waves, surges, tides, storms, and recently has become involved in the development of technology related to the forecasting of floods. Third comes Denise Aleman. He is a coral biologist, and he is the scientific director of the Centre Scientifique de Monaco. He's speaking to us from Monaco. His main field of research concerns the physiology of marine organisms, mainly sea urchins and corals. He is studying the impact of environmental changes on these sorts of creatures. And finally, we have Mark Driessen. He is the manager of public affairs for Portos Rotterdam. Portos is developing an independent open access infrastructure for transport and storage of carbon dioxide, particularly under the ocean. This event is only 1 hour. Each speaker will speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have opportunity for questions from you. And if you in the audience have questions, please either email them or use Twitter to send them to us. The email address is GEP, it stands for Global Environment Program, GEP@wilsoncenter.org, or tweet us at WilsonCenterGEP, at WilsonCenterGEP. And without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Hans Portner. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. I hope you can all see my screen and can hear me.
Yes.
I would like to present today to you and talk to you about my experience as IPCC co-chair, building on my research activities on the ocean. We have, during this cycle, published 3 special reports. One of them on global warming of 1.5 degrees, then one of them on climate change and land, and the third one on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. We have, and we have taken a systems view and have discussed the ocean in virtually all of these reports, even in the land report concerning the coastal issues. So what I will be talking about today is actually looking at it in a way that we should have a systems view, because we are concerned about the climate. The climate concerns all of the planet. And a statement I would like to make is that we should be treating the ocean similar to or the same as land, because in many ways we have similar issues for both systems. The oceans were for a long time not really fully considered in the climate convention. And this has changed. The ocean community has made an initiative. I've been witnessing these activities and was successful, so that the ocean now has a string of discussions in the UNFCCC. But building on that success, we should at the same time building links to the other systems. We have 3 systems, 3 crises that we should be considering, and this is currently all coming together to a more holistic vision. One of them is the climate crisis that David has been referring to. The next one is the biodiversity crisis, and that again concerns land and ocean concomitantly. And the third one is a societal crisis, where we have an uneven distribution of resources across the planet. We have inequities, we have injustices, and we need to be inclusive. We need to balance the interests of all. And this societal crisis has been exacerbated by the current pandemic. So in such a holistic view, we should be well aware that we can solve any one of these issues if we solve the 3 together, focusing on the oceans, on their biodiversity, and on the impact of climate change on the oceans has a societal aspect as well for those who depend on the oceans, for the resources, for fisheries, and so forth. So being very specific here, I think, and being specific and at the same time comprehensive here is a very important aspect to be considered. So there are solutions. If we talk about climate change in the oceans, we talk about warming, we talk about oxygen loss, we talk about ocean acidification. For us, the challenge coming from the ocean also includes sea level rise, and we will hear more of that later. But the ocean also can help us solving the issue. We can build carbon stores in ocean ecosystems. And again, there are some similarities with the land sector, building up biomass in coastal waters like the mangroves, the seaweeds or seagrass ecosystems would help us balancing our CO2 budget. But it must be very clear that our natural systems, while they can support us, they cannot solve the issue. We have to be fast in cutting back on our emissions. And by that, we keep climate change to its limits, and then we can have healthy ecosystems helping us with stabilizing the climate system. I think this is the overarching message. I would stimulate us when we talk about the oceans to also connect to other communities like the one that is looking at similar issues on land. We should keep the Paris Agreement in mind and clearly see that only when limiting global warming at the lowest possible level, and that may actually be with tremendous effort, 1.5 degrees, we will be able to reach the sustainable development goals of the United Nations. So again, we have systems that are mutually dependent here. Development goals and keeping climate change under control are also interdependent issues. That is a message coming out of our IPCC assessment reports. And with that, I would like to conclude my opening remarks and thank you very much for your attention. And please watch us as we are going now into the second half of our 6th assessment cycle and bring all of this together in our main assessment reports, covering issues from the physical side of climate change to impacts and vulnerabilities and adaptation options, to the options to mitigate and reduce the degree of global warming. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Hans, for that presentation. Next speaker, Jennifer, you have the floor, ma'am.
Well, hi everyone. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of my research. So I'm interested in measuring changing coastal hazards, so creating new technologies that measure hazard and can also nowcast hazard to help people that are responding to storm events like flooding at the coast, to respond carefully and accurately to protect property, people and transport. So you'll see in my photo that there's a wave crashing over the top of a seawall and there's someone on this walkway. You can see that the waves are also bringing a lot of debris over the seawall with them. So coastal hazards isn't just about water moving around, it's also about debris, sand, erosion and things like that. With rising sea levels, there's going to be a lot more hazards in the future. Waves will be brought higher up seawalls and be able to overtop more frequently. So to be able to help managers plan for the future, we are trying to develop new tools. We're needing to collect measurements to develop these new tools so we can calibrate the models that they use to forecast change and also design new schemes. So this is one of the systems that we've recently developed. It's known as a wire wall system because it uses a capacitance system. So it's a mesh of wires. And I'll just show you a quick movie to show you what happens. As the wave overtops the seawall, the plume of spray goes through our grid of wires, and we measure both the speed and the volume of the water as it passes over the seed events horizontally. And it's this information that we need to collect to be able to better validate the numerical tools we use to forecast coastal hazard. These sensors can also provide a near real-time feed of information so people can know where hazard and overtopping is occurring. Going forward, so we're moving away from concrete defences and we're starting to look more at nature-based solutions. They can provide multiple benefits. So nature-based solutions can provide habitats, but they also act as carbon sinks as we aim to move towards a net zero in carbon emissions. So these photos are an example from the UK where we kind of have salt marshes growing and establishing along our beaches, and they're now becoming known as green beaches. But also I have a photo from Australia where mangroves are being planted. And by using these vegetated systems, we're trying to attenuate waves before they impact the coast and before they can impact people, property or transport infrastructure. And there's a lot of different nature-based solutions out there as well. But to support managers in designing what scheme, what approach to use, we need to have tools to project how they'll behave in the future as these systems grow and evolve over time. So large storms can cause destruction and then the systems will naturally recover. So what we need to do is collect measurements now about how these systems provide resistance to flood risk, and then we can help support managers plan how to manage the coast going into the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's excellent. Our next speaker, Denise Aleman, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I will try in the next few minutes to speak about coral reef. Coral reef are probably a symbol, a model for people for conservation problem. What are coral reef? Coral reef are probably the most important ecosystem on the planet, which host almost 30% of all marine biodiversity. The productivity of this ecosystem is similar to tropical forest. But what is very interesting is the link between this ecosystem with humanity, with human. Probably there is a very few ecosystems similar to coral reef where the link is so direct between biology and economy. Indeed, coral reef support about 500 million of people living in this environment, mainly in the Pacific. Jennifer just told us about coastal protection. Reef are given coastal protection to island and coast, but you have also revenue from fisheries for food production and for tourism. It was calculated that the benefit from coral reef is around $400 billion per year. It's a huge amount. But unfortunately, these reefs are now under threat. This is called by his Prince Albert II of Monaco in the ICRI website. There is a major problem with coral reef, and the Prince Albert II Foundation launched a major program on the coral reef life declaration. What are the problems for reef? There are in fact two major problems. The first is a local problem, probably the less important. You have a myriad of threats on reef, like land degradation, diving, fisheries, cyanide, fisheries, and using bomb and so on, and land production on the reef. This problem can be easily regulated. The most important problem for reef is the effect of global warming, which leads to a process called coral bleaching, the divorce between the coral and the algae, which are living inside the cell of the coral. This coral bleaching appears now more and more important. It starts around 80, and now it's become increased in intensity, in also in the frequency. Hans Otto spoke about global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. This report, as highlighted in yellow, suggests that reef may disappear for an increase of temperature of 2 degrees Celsius, which is probably very possible. This means that coral reef will be the first ecosystem which will disappear at the surface of this planet. Then we have to develop solution. The hazard is that we just published yesterday. This paper was published yesterday in the Biological Conservation, It's a study we made with 20 scientists. Many are leading specialists of coral reef. This study explores the known solution for coral reef to save, to conserve coral reef. And what we observe is that there is no longer time for discussion. Facts are here. We know, everybody knows that reefs are in danger. Then it's time to solution. And we also find that the existing measures are no longer sufficient to protect this ecosystem. We need really to go rapidly and to develop a well-designed solution. Similar to that finally other grand challenge, such as the conquest of the moon, the Apollo 11 mission. These are similar challenge: save the reef, save an ecosystem, or go to the moon. As many examples of solution, I would like just to show the one solution that we want to develop here based in Monaco, but throughout the world with the network of aquarium and laboratory. It's a solution that we call World Coral Conservatory. It's a kind of Noah Ark for coral, for living coral, grown in the public aquarium. We set up a system with about 20 public aquarium around the world to cultivate in aquariums the corals, and with a network of laboratory which lead to develop research on this ecosystem and to select resistant species on a system called assisted evolution. And these resistant species will be used to restore degraded reef. Of course, there are also other solutions like develop marine protected area, but this system are not very useful when you have an increase in temperature, in water temperature. Selecting resistant species will be a good solution in the future to restore degraded reef. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Denise, for that. And our final speaker now, Mark Thiessen. The floor is yours, sir.
Thanks very much, David. And hello to everyone from Rotterdam, where for the past, well, I just noticed almost 4 years, I've been involved in the Portos project. Portos actually is an acronym for Port of Rotterdam Transport Hub and Offshore Storage. Not a lot of people know that. And as David shortly mentioned already, we are trying to build an open access, independent infrastructure for transport and storage of CO2. And that means we are trying to build quite a huge pipeline all the way through the port area. It's more than 30 kilometers in length, where industrial emitters can deliver their CO2 to us. We transport it all the way to the edge of the port area, and from there on through an offshore pipeline to an empty gas field in the North Sea. We are aiming to start with 2.5 million tons of CO2 per year and fill the gas field with an estimated capacity of 37 million tons. So in about 15 years, we'll have this part of the project finished. We are working towards our final investment decision, which is estimated at the beginning of next year, so the first quarter of 2022. And then hopefully after a 2-year building construction phase, we can actually start storing the first molecules of CO2 in 2024. And why are we doing this? Well, that actually goes back to the Paris Agreement and the ambition, 2 degrees, better even 1.5 degrees Celsius now. And the Port of Rotterdam, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Port of Rotterdam. It's the biggest port in Europe, but it's also the biggest fossil fuel-based industrial cluster in Europe. At least that's in the Port of Rotterdam area. And so after the Paris Agreement, we looked out our window and we saw this vast amount of CO2 emissions. And we thought, well, is it realistic to deliver the ambition set out in the Paris Agreement in this area? Because we have about 20%, a little less now, 17% of the national CO2 emissions of the Netherlands in this port area. So if we don't deliver in the Port of Rotterdam, then the Netherlands will never reach their ambition, and further on, even Europe cannot reach their targets. So we set out a research. Is it possible? Is it feasible to reach 95% CO2 reduction in 2050? The answer was yes. There are different scenarios with lots of mixes of all technologies needed to reach the target. But one of the technologies that cannot be missing is CCS, carbon capture and storage. So that's why we set out. People involved in CCS or who know the technology know that it's not an end solution. It's a transitional technology needed because there's only a limited carbon budget left to stay within the 1.5 degrees limits. So, and Rotterdam is quite unique in a sense. I mean, you should look it up if you don't know it. Google Maps is very easy nowadays to look it up and see the vast amount of industry there. But we're a huge port, but from a CCS perspective, it's a lot of emissions on a relatively small area. And all these industries are already connected. They're also working on hydrogen solutions, on other solutions. They're delivering hydrogen to each other. And there are some world-class companies here who are still willing to invest in the area and in their facilities and in decarbonizing these facilities. And to top it all off, and that's the link to the session today, I believe, we have lots of storage opportunities right on our doorstep. The first empty gas field that we want to use is only 20 kilometers away from the coastline, which is really a short distance. There we can use the existing platform and the existing wells who are now being used for the gas exploration, of course, the gas production. And we are able to make use of geological structures more than 3 kilometers underneath the seabed, where it's proven that this natural gas has been safely, well, not stored, it was just there. I don't think stored is the right word, but natural gas has been there for 10,000, 100,000, perhaps millions of years without any damage. So we believe it's very safe to store. Of course, we're doing a lot of research whether it's actually really safe. We cannot do this if we're not sure that we can do it safely, to store CO2 in there. As I said, the first steps will be only 37 million tons. But to give you an indication of the opportunity that lies underneath the North Sea, is that only in the Dutch part of the North Sea, there's also a British part, there's a Norwegian part, there's a Danish part, and I believe also a small German part of the North Sea. But only in the Dutch part of the North Sea, there's an estimated 1,600 million tons of storage capacity available that can be used for CO2. Well, as I said, we're doing a lot of research. Once we start, we will not get any permits if we can't prove that we can do it safely, that we will monitor it properly, and that we have any remedial measures in place for any certain case that anything goes wrong. But we believe we are having a sort of a flagship project, if I can be so humble to name it a flagship project, which hopefully can lead the way in Europe for lots more of these projects, which actually are just utterly necessary to reach the climate targets. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks to all of you. So for our audience members, let me remind you that if you have questions for any of our panelists, you can get them to us in one of two ways. You can email them to us at GEP, stands for Global Environment Program, GEP@wilsoncenter.org, or you can use Twitter. We are at Wilson Center GEP. And while we're waiting for questions to arrive, I have a few for you already, and I'd like to start with you, Hans. So this week, the US Special Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, traveled to China. This is on the heels of the US rejoining the Paris Agreement. And there were some commitments the two sides made to work together, individually and together, I'd say, to address the climate crisis. From your perspective, how critical is it that the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement and that the US and China are working together, or at least have committed to working together once again?
Thanks, David. That is certainly one of the more crucial questions discussed over recent years, while the US had paused engaging in the climate business. And there are two sides to it. One side is that this has reminded everybody else of their own responsibility, contributing to activities like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where the activities of the US have also been slightly reduced. But there were funding questions there. So it has really told the world that there is a shared responsibility for these issues. And then the other side, and certainly some countries and also EU were stimulated to step up to be leaders in this realm. So this was the positive side. And the other side of the coin certainly was that without the US, this wouldn't, and their engagement and ambition, this wouldn't be possible to reach the Paris Agreement. And the US and China coordinating on their targets, despite their economic competition, is a most crucial event along these lines, because and with John Kerry being the climate envoy of the US, he is such a broad view. He has been engaging at the COPs, he has been engaging for the oceans, and he has led the first ever Our Ocean Conference in Washington, which was a landmark event. I think this bodes well for the future, but we must also remind us all that when we respect the laws of chemistry and physics and biology on the planet, there is no compromise on reaching our emission goals. And this will be an ambition that we are now seeing a start, but we are not yet there, and we have to really measure in the end the success of these activities by these changes.
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, I was very much involved in that first Our Ocean Conference and working with then Secretary Kerry on that. We probably will never have a US Secretary of State who cared quite as much about the oceans as he did, that's for sure. Jennifer, I had a question for you, and thank you very much for your presentation. I was struck by the slides you showed about nature-based solutions, about the constructing or reconstructing of salt marshes and mangroves along the coast. In your experience, does the private sector tend to push back against those types of solutions? I mean, coastal areas are usually prime spots for development of other sorts of things that would sort of conflict with the building of sea marshes and the restoration of mangroves. Do you have a sense that there's some tension here with these nature-based solutions and those who would prefer to develop these areas in other ways?
I don't think there is pushback. People know that we need to maintain habitats. The more we build at the coast, the more we're losing at the coast, and people are starting to see that. There are talks around kind of hybrid solutions where you use nature alongside your more traditional grey concrete systems as well. But nature in that kind of setting can help prolong the life cycle of a more traditional seawall. So when there's critical infrastructure, if there's property, if there's transport, obviously you do need to be able to maintain the infrastructure as well. So you need to have secure foundations. But if you can use nature to break up the waves before they impact your infrastructure, then that is going to be beneficial, and you'll be able to reduce the maintenance costs to be able to look after your stretch of coastline. So I would say that people are working together to see how they can work with nature, and I don't think there is particular pushback at the minute now.
Glad to hear that. I hope that is true worldwide. Denise, I had a question for you. In your presentation, toward the end, you described the efforts of the World Coral Conservatory, and if I understood what you were saying, you're looking for species of corals that are resistant to acidification and sea surface temperature warming. the sorts of corals that then could be used, right, to restore coral reefs that are degrading. Have you had success so far? Have you been able to identify some species that are resistant in these ways, that show promise in this regard?
Yeah, many thanks for your question. Just before answering your question, I would like to add something to the answer of Jennifer.
Okay.
It's very important that she's saying building solution, nature-based solution is effectively more interesting, not only for environmental conditions, but also because most of these ecosystems like seagrass, mangrove, and so on are also a zone for carbon sinks. And then by protecting or restoring this ecosystem, not only you will be able to protect the coast from erosion, but also to build natural carbon sink ecosystem, which is very important. Now to answer your question, it's a very good question. In fact, I am not so pessimistic as the expert of IPCC for the total disappearance of reef at the end of the century, because from place to place we can find some resistant coral. For example, in the Persian Gulf, which is a very particular place with temperature go from 15 degrees in the winter to 35 degrees in the summer. And you have some, not a lot, but some species of coral which are in a very well condition. This means that you can have natural possibility for growing resistant species. It's also the case in the Red Sea. Coral in the Red Sea are quite able to resist to high temperature. Of course, if the temperature go very, very high, this coral will disappear. This is observed in the nature, but in the lab, you can be able to select coral which are more resistant, not only by mutation during a lot of generation, but also by epigenetic mechanism, which means kind of rapid evolution of this organism. And here in Monaco, in our lab, we for example, we are growing coral which are able to grow at a very low pH level, near pH 7.2, which is 1 pH unit lower than the present pH of the seawater. And some colleagues in Hawaii and Australia found the same thing for temperature, which means that by selecting coral which are under high temperature or ocean acidification threat, you can arrive to select resilient strain of this organism. Like, in fact, for other kind of organism, it's for oyster is the same thing. You in some place you may have some more resistant oyster to ocean acidification, for example.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have a couple of questions coming in, but let me ask a final one of my own. This one to Mark, if you're willing. So Mark, if I understand what you're describing, this project is still under development, right? But are you trying to not only have a successful project, but also one that might be replicated in other places of the world? Are you trying to demonstrate, prove a concept that this can work and can be replicated elsewhere?
Definitely, David. In a sense, the Netherlands has a history of failure with CCS. Tried several projects, but never delivered anything. And now I believe in Europe at least, but I believe also more worldwide, there's a stronger belief and a stronger need for CCS. The necessity is more clear to everyone. And there's a belief that in industrial clusters where you have a lot of these emissions together, building independent infrastructure, leading to storage fields, of course you need these storage fields, not everyone has these, could be the way forward for CCS and the most logical places to start such a project. And for example, it's these storage fields underneath the sea are very unevenly divided between nations. Right, our southern neighbors, Belgium, they don't have anything. I mean, it's the same sea in front of them, but there are no empty gas fields there. And that we do have lots of opportunities as the Netherlands. France, I believe, also has to look further to the north towards our part of the North Sea to come to any storage facilities. So yes, we are trying to demonstrate it, but it's not that you can replicate it everywhere. You need the right conditions, of course, but anywhere that you have an industrial cluster and where you have, well, whether it be depleted gas fields or aquifers in the sea, which you can use, we hope we can demonstrate something to be able to replicate it for everyone, who wants to.
Okay, thank you. Hans, I see your hand raised. Did you want to add something to the discussion at this point?
Yeah, having been involved in the 1.5 report myself, I wanted to balance a little bit what Dennis has been telling us. Certainly, the focus of that statement in terms of the percent challenge to coral reefs is linked to the composition of that community, to its biodiversity, and the surface area of coverage that present reefs can maintain. There is the possibility that these reefs, just like other organisms, would be able, if they have enough time, to migrate to higher latitudes. Some of this expansion is currently seen around places like Okinawa, where we see northward movement of these corals. And in terms of the heat resistance, I would be very careful projecting that in the places where we currently have the reefs, so in their core distribution, we can have kinds that are more heat tolerant. There is a relationship between the complexity of organisms and of a system and its heat tolerance. We are currently seeing a decline in overall biodiversity at the equator, sort of in the hottest places in the ocean. We see a valley building up, and that matches projections, and that matches observations in paleo periods in Earth's history, where we've lost biodiversity in the lowest latitudes. So the tropics, where we have poor countries, where we have developing countries who are depending on marine resources, the vulnerability to climate change is highest. And we are well advised not to advocate solutions that may take us into a very risky future, because we are not knowing to what extent they can play out at the large surface areas that we would need them at. And this is, so that makes me advocate more for a precautionary approach and for keeping to the climate temperature discussed in the Paris Agreement. I thought this would be added. I would actually have a question myself to Mark, to what extent his activities are linked to the Norwegian activities in the Sleipner field, and whether there's an exchange of experience. But we could also do that offline if that is not fitting the context.
Well, thank you very much, Otto. Well, Mark, would you like to try to take that question now?
Yeah, but we have a lot of contact with the Northern Lights. We are both developing, in a way, similar projects. The two, I think, furthest developed CCS projects in Europe. So we see them everywhere. Usually when I present, there's also somebody from Northern Lights there. The project, as it's called in Norway, present. Today I'm on my own. But no, there's a lot of contact. And it's, of course, also due to the COVID crisis, it's not easy to keep each other up to date and learn from each other. But it's so important to keep learning from each other in developing these projects, because otherwise everyone is, how do you say it? Well, doing it on its own, while all the information is, well, can be presented on a plate by somebody else who has already done it. So, but there's a lot of context, and I'm very willing to do that offline as well if you want to know more.
Okay, let us start turning to the questions that have come in now from audience members. The first is from Don Greenwood. He asked, and I'm not sure who this is for, perhaps you, Hans, is there a relationship between the problem of overfishing, I would add in illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, on the one hand, and the ability of the oceans to continue to serve as a kind of sink for carbon and otherwise as an ally in trying to address the climate change? How do overfishing and climate effects sort of relate to one another with respect to the oceans?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Certainly the oceans do a large service to humankind by storing away 30% of the CO2 that is coming from human emissions. And the capacity of the oceans in terms of store it away physically just in the water column is projected to decline with progressive climate change, because the solubility of CO2 is declining, and because the pH buffering capacity of the seawater is declining. Now, there are recent findings actually that fishing activities, the disturbance of marine sediments is freeing CO2 from its former store in the sediment. So disturbing the marine sediments doesn't seem to be good for the ocean and the capacity to hold the CO2. There is also thought about that the biomass of marine organisms, the build up of biomass during conservation efforts, would also make a contribution to storing even more CO2. All of us, in some respects, store carbon. So rebuilding fish stocks, rebuilding the stocks of marine mammals, the whales, in the ocean, and means rebuilding also their activities by bringing nutrients into the water, by causing blooms, which would then also take up more CO2. In all of this, in the context of what we can call nature-based solutions, would make a contribution. And there is one positive message out of the 1.5 report. The more ambitious we are with emissions reduction, which includes meeting the climate, the targets along the way, the mileposts. So it's 45% emissions reduction by 2030 compared to 2010, which would, for Germany, for a country like Germany, for example, mean it should be 65% compared to their normal milepost, which is 1990. Then going into net zero by 2050, we then would have, for climate stabilization, to go into net negative emissions to keep the 1.5. And if we are ambitious enough and meet those mileposts, we can actually, by rebuilding ecosystems and their capacity, rely less on technologies, very expensive technologies that Mark has been, like the one that Mark has been laying out for us. So this is a very important context that we should keep in mind. Thank you.
Okay. Our next question is for you, Jennifer. It comes from Brian Rossborough. He uses an acronym I don't know, maybe you will know, but he asks, will storm surge and SLR create more dangerous rip currents by altering the coastal tides and currents? You know, it's the rip currents currently kill about 60,000 people a year. Can you comment on this?
I think that will be very location specific. So rip currents are generated because the waves approach the coast, they break, then that water needs to get back out to sea. And that return current is the fast current that can take surfers, swimmers back out. So surfers like it because it's an easy way of paddling back out and then they can catch the next wave. Swimmers don't like it so much because they're suddenly a long way offshore. So there's a lot of work going on with the RNLI in the UK, our local life-saving charities and the Coast Guards, looking at future change and being able to understand these processes. But each system's going to respond differently. So if it's a natural system, sand dunes or cliffs, they're eroding, they're evolving all the time. So where the break position of the waves are will keep changing. So it might not just be sea level rising, the beach might also be responding. Where you've got a seawall, then the shoreline can't always adjust. So then the water might be getting deeper, the waves might be getting bigger. So then that might impact the rip currents. But I wouldn't say there's a direct relationship. You need to understand how that system is evolving and how the shoreline position is also evolving as well under those circumstances.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question is for you, Denise, but it's possible Jennifer also has a view on this. It's from Julianne Ballard, who asks, do we have a good idea about how much nature-based solutions such as mangrove restoration or coral reef restoration can store carbon and the monetary value they bring in terms of carbon offsets? Has there been some work to quantify this?
Yes, yeah, it's a very good question. First, we have to have in mind that coral reef are not carbon storage, are not carbon sink. Mangrove are carbon sink. Seagrass beds are carbon sink. Salt marsh are carbon sink. But the coral reef are not carbon sink because you have associated to the photosynthesis of the algae, you have a process called biomineralization, which lead to the construction of the reef, construction of the skeleton, and this is producing acidity. And then we don't, coral reef are not carbon sink. Now to come back to the question, yes, there are a lot of study dealing about the mangrove restoration, for example, and the carbon storage process. So it's quite well documented. But also we have to take into account this kind of ecosystem, not only seagrass bed and mangrove, are not only a site of carbon storage, but they also are a site of epuration of water. There was some study who demonstrate that bacteria, for example, from the runoff from lands can be epurated, pathogenic bacteria can be epurated in this ecosystem. Then the value of this ecosystem is very, very important. As Jennifer said, there's coastal protection, carbon storage, and epuration of water. But yeah, for concerning coral reef, it's not a carbon sink.
Okay, thank you for that, and thank you for that clarification. Our next question comes from Brenda Speck-Luna. I probably could go to any of you, but I might direct it to Mark if he's willing. She asked, do you believe that technology, such as the kinds of technology you are working on, will be able to provide all the solutions to achieve the climate goal of 1.5 degrees? Or will there have to be changes in people's behavior and habits? And to achieve the latter, won't it be necessary for governments to pass legislation requiring such changes? What is a change in that? So I guess the question at heart is, will technological solutions be enough? What do you think?
That's a good question. Personally, I don't think it will be enough. I have a strong belief in technology and that a lot is possible. But if I only look at our own project, it takes about 7 years to develop it from start to finish. It's a long time. If you look at our targets, the first targets are set for 2030 and the next 2050. Sometimes people think it's a long time away, but I think that people underestimate how quickly it will be 2050. So I have a strong belief in technology, of course, and it's needed. But that's more a personal opinion. I think if people will not start changing any behavior, that, well, we might have a pretty hard time reaching these targets. Yes.
Thank you. Anybody else have a view on that? Yes, Hans?
Yeah, thank you. Certainly in the IPCC, we have provided a full picture, which clearly indicates that without ambitious emissions reduction, the Paris temperature targets cannot be reached and kept. And this means that all of what we are thinking about as additional measures, be it nature-based solutions, which by itself has a capacity, for example, for the ocean, 0.5% of human emissions. You can immediately see it's not enough to even make up for a significant fraction of the current order of magnitude emissions. And the technology certainly will run into limitations of storage sites. We have already heard about the trade-offs in terms of finding the right storage sites under the North Sea for Europe. No, we need ambitious emissions reduction by transitions in our technology, by transitions in our behaviors, unless we can do the same thing differently with renewables. There is the option, and we have an excess renewable energy on the planet available in wind and sun and so forth. It really needs engineering efforts to bring this up to scale. And it would also need behavior change. We need to protect natural ecosystems, protect biodiversity. We need to reduce our meat consumption, and we need to produce meat in ecosystems which are able to carry the animal biomass, like natural savannas. But chopping down rainforests, planting soy, and using the soy for feeding cattle in the US and Europe is certainly not a good way of using the resources of the planet. This is all of this is captured under the term sustainability, and there are many processes that need to be rethought and changed in order to meet that goal.
Okay, thanks very much. We have another question from Ayuska Malta. I'm not sure to whom it's directed, so any of you who may have a view on this, feel free to jump in. Do you believe, this is related to the last question we were just discussing, do you believe that there is a way for us to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade without carbon capture and storage? It's sort of the inverse of the last question. Is CCS a necessary component of a strategy to achieve the Paris goal or goals?
Well, I think for me, the answer is obvious. Yes, that's what in our opinion, almost every single research nowadays shows. And the only thing I keep saying is that it's not just about CCS. So only invest in CCS if you also invest in all the other technologies, in the real transition technologies. Of course, CCS, as I tried to explain, is here for a short time to stay within the carbon budget. But of course, it doesn't change the fossil system as such. So, but yes, it is very necessary. And one small anecdote, I believe what I found interesting is that there are people opposed to CCS. We had the Green Party in the Netherlands strongly opposed. They are now supporting us. Mm-hmm. Not overly excited, but they say, yeah, well, the simple thing is, by doing decades or doing nothing for decades, we now need CCS. Yeah. And in a sense, I think he's totally right.
Yeah. And there may be some even more aggressive types of what used to be called geoengineering that people have opposed, but maybe we'll start considering in the future. I have a final question. We only have a couple of minutes, and it's for you, Jennifer. It's from Ann Stewart. She's writing in from North Carolina here in the States. Would you comment on the value or the utility of jetties and groins to control beach erosion? She's involved in an effort in central coastal North Carolina to deal with coastal erosion. Would like to be able to propose alternatives. What do you think about jetties and groins?
So they have a place. If you need to catch sediment, they obviously catch sediment. And if you need to kind of have a jetty or something for moorings, then you obviously need to consider that. But obviously, when you start putting infrastructure in the coast, it starts stopping the natural pathway of sediment movement. So there is always going to be an impact downstream or downdrift of that. So when you're planning schemes, you always have to look at the bigger picture and see if you're stopping sediment locally, what's going to happen downstream. And that's why people are trying to move away from these engineered structures and try and work more with nature, because it's the wider impacts. A lot of coastal management initially looked at the local area, but now definitely in the UK, we're trying to look more at a national scale. So if you intervene in one location, what's the impact going to be in the next bay or the next couple of bays, because you might be causing an increase in erosion or increased flood risk.
Thank you. So friends, I'm afraid we are out of time. It's at the top of the hour. On behalf of Daniel Hamilton and Teresa Eder from the Global Environment Europe program, rather, I want to thank all of you who've been listening in, and please join me in thanking as well our speakers, Hans-Otto Portner, Jennifer Brown, Denise Aleman, and Mark Thiessen. Thank you all for your participation today, and stay tuned for the events tomorrow and the next day. Dan, did you want to say anything before we sign off? No. Thanks all to everyone, and I will look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Take care.